The title of our talk is the Prosody of Questions in Brazilian Portuguese Infant-Directed Speech. My name is Cristina from Federal University of Juiz de Fora, and my colleague is Juan Manuel Sosa from Federal University of Juiz de Fora and from Simon Fraser University. This is the outline of our presentation. Infant-directed speech characteristics, intonation of questions in Brazilian Portuguese, our study, results, and conclusions.
According to the literature, infant-directed speech compared with adult-directed speech has higher number of repetitions, fewer words per utterance, simpler structures with lower number of subordinates, and relevant to our research, higher amount of questions, and also higher pitch and greater pitch variations, longer pauses between utterances, slower speed, vowel and syllable stretching, and hyperarticulation.
It's interesting. We have a higher amount of questions, although babies would be unable to answer them. In Brazilian Portuguese, questions differ from statements in prosodic aspects only, as we shall see. If questions in Brazilian Portuguese infant-directed speech show exaggerated intonation features, it could help infants learning this language to distinguish them from statements.
Yes/no questions in Brazilian Portuguese tend to be rising-falling, with a peak on the final stressed syllable, the so-called circumflex contour. The difference with statements is the final contour, which has a rise to the final stressed syllable and a final fall. The nucleus of yes/no questions consists of an accentual rise and a low boundary tone. Let's hear an example, spoken by the first author.
Renata jogava? Renata jogava?
WH questions tend to be falling throughout the utterance. They begin with high pitch on the WH word with gradual fall over the following syllables until the last stressed syllable with a low fall nuclear contour. Rising as well as rising falling WH questions also occur. They are used for specific contexts like echo questions or exclamations. We'll hear an example spoken by the first author.
Como ela jogava? Como ela jogava?
In our data, we found all different kinds of contours for questions. Falls, rises, rise falls, and plateau contours occurred for both yes, no, and WH questions. Now, our study. We investigate the prosody of questions addressed to Brazilian Portuguese pre-verbal infants in infant-directed speech. The prosodic features taken under consideration were register, pitch range, tempo, breathiness, and tonal variation.
Classification of questions. We distinguished two types of questions, yes/no questions and WH questions, and three communicative functions of questions, information-seeking questions, rhetorical questions, and semi-rhetorical questions. Information-seeking question. Example.
Quer chupeta? Quer chupeta?
Rhetorical question. The caregiver does not expect an answer. She wants the baby's commitment. Example.
Cadê a bolsa da mãe? Cadê a bolsa da mãe?
Semi-rhetorical question. The caregiver does not search for information from the baby, nor his engagement only. She wants to check the understanding of the baby. Example.
De quem que é essa mãozinha aqui? De quem que é essa mãozinha aqui?
Methods. The participants were 7 caregivers, 5 women, mothers, grandmother, and great-grandmother, and 2 men, 1 father, 1 uncle, and 4 babies. Do a 4.5-month-old female baby, Ben, a 6.5-month-old male baby, B, a 6 to 10-month-old female baby, and 2, an 11.5-month-old female baby. The data consisted of 68 minutes of recordings of the speech directed to our 4 infants in real-life interactions between the caregivers and the babies. We found 285 questions out of 871 utterances, which were 32.7% of the total.
The prosodic features of questions that we took into consideration for this study, as we said before, were register, pitch excursion size, voice quality, tempo, and also accented vowel lengthening. Now let's talk about the prosodic features of questions. Register, whether the pitch of the whole utterance was uttered as normal or high range, that is, whether the lower and upper limits of the pitch movement in hertz was within the expected adult-like range, or if the whole utterance was raised, affecting both the tonal baseline and the upper limit. We considered high those questions with a baseline above 130 Hz for males and 250 Hz for females. Pitch excursion size. This refers to the quantitative difference between peaks and valleys, measured in semitones and octaves. Differences reaching an octave or more, either up or down, were considered as marked for these features. Voice quality. We distinguished whether a question or part of a question was perceptually breathy or not. Tempo, whether the utterance showed a substantial increase in duration as opposed to normal speed, as reported in the literature on Brazilian Portuguese. Accented vowel lengthening, whether the final accented vowel as well as the post-nuclear ones had a significant extra duration. Prosodic features of questions. As mentioned before, we considered the shape of the terminal pitch contour, falling, rising, rising, falling, or plateau, that is, flat, as we shall see in the following examples.
Results. The majority of questions was double-age questions, 196, almost 69% of all questions. Concerning intention types of questions, 128 were rhetorical, which were almost 45% of all questions. It's interesting to see that double-age structures were produced as rhetorical or semi-rhetorical questions most of the time. They were 73.5% of double-age questions, while information-seeking questions were produced in both double-age and yes-no structures. 74.4% of questions were marked by one or more of the prosodic features. 55% of double-age questions presented a falling contour, and 67% of yes-no questions presented a rising-falling contour.
You will hear an example of repetitions with high register spoken by B's mother. Both instances end with high rising intonation with extremely high pitch rises, in this case as much as almost 900 Hz at the end. Such high register seems to be a feature of rhetorical questions addressed to very young infants, rather than information-seeking questions.
Cadê a Bia? Cadê a Bia? Cadê a Bia? Cadê a Bia?
An example of the very extensive pitch excursion used in infant-directed speech is the following falling WH question, also spoken by B's mother. In this case, the fall spans 21 semitones, an octave and 9 semitones, from the very high WH word to the final low boundary tone.
O que você vai fazer com a estrela, filha? O que você vai fazer com a estrela, filha?
Here we see a plateau intonation that begins with a rise that stays very high, around 600 Hz. This question is almost sing-songy. It is also fairly long, almost 2 seconds in duration, spoken by Ben's great-grandmother.
Cadê a luzinha do Benjamin? Cadê a luzinha do Benjamin?
Discussion. Questions were 32.7% of all utterances encountered, that 285 out of 871. That's slightly lower than what is reported in the literature. 74.4% were marked as infant-directed speech by their prosodic features, so they were high in register, very pronounced differences between peaks and falls, frequently reaching an octave or more either up or down, sometimes slower in tempo, some breathiness, and maybe these features were used as cues for statement versus question distinction. Concerning the types of questions, 68.8% were doublet questions. That's 196 out of 285. Of those, 55% had a falling contour. 51.5% were rhetorical questions. Yes-no questions. 67% had the canonical rise-fall contour of the standard questions. 60.7% were information-seeking questions. These features could be cues for WH versus yes-no question distinction. Information-seeking questions and semi-rhetorical questions increase with age. Differences in the input to the same baby, B, as she ages, between 8 and 10.5 months, less rhetorical questions and more semi-rhetorical questions and information-seeking questions. So we see a progression from purely rhetorical interactional questions toward genuine questions. Conclusion. Questions in our corpus diverge from Brazilian Portuguese adult-directed speech. They are marked with one or more prosodic features, which typifies it as infant-directed speech. This is true for almost 3/4 of all the questions in our data. The most common feature for all speakers were high register and ampler pitch range. High peaks, breathiness, and slower tempo were also observed. Not all the features, though, were present all the time. Some caregivers displayed high peaks, whereas others used also breathiness and slower tempo. Only wide pitch range and increased register was consistently used by all. Our data suggest that for very young babies, the majority of questions addressed to them are marked prosodically by the features we analyzed. These exaggerated prosodic features may be used by infants as cues to start distinguishing questions from statements and between WH and yes-no questions. However, as they grow, there is an increase in information-seeking questions and a reduction of purely interactive and effective active speech, more concerned with engaging the baby without expecting verbal responses.
Thank you for listening, and thank you, caregivers, and thank you, babies.